Now, I remember that last time we had a discussion about where we would continue. There was a possibility of bedikas toloim for bugs. There was a possibility of kashrus laws and who to trust in kashrus. So I don't know which comes first, but in the order of the Tzurbah MiRabanan, which looks like this. So the first section that they have here on the kashrus laws is who's believed and trusted in kashrus. And then after that section, they have the laws of Dam and then the laws of Toloim. So I think we'll try to maybe follow their progression, because maybe they're following what you have to know practically before you go on to the next stage. So, you want to know who's trustworthy in kashrus, because very often you're going to buy foods that need checking for bugs and stuff like that. So we start with a sugya in Masechta Gittin, and for those who are learning Daf Yomi, they might remember this daf. Emor de Amrinon Eidechad Nebisurit. We have a principle that we trust one witness with regard to Isurim, and that's a big chiddush, because the Torah says Al Pishnayim Eidim Yakum Davar, and the Torah requires two witnesses, but that's only in Dine Momenos, in Dover Sheva Erva, in Dine Nefashos, but now we're dealing with Dine Isurim. So we're not dealing really with the issue of punishment. To punish someone for violating an Isur, we'll probably need two Eidim, and certainly if it's Dine Nefashos. But now we're just talking about looking at this piece of meat and telling me, is this Chalev or is it Shuman? Am I allowed to eat it? Well, for example, looking at a cup of wine and deciding whether this wine is Yayin Nesach or not. So we have this principle called Eidecha Nem Bisurim. Higon, and the Gemara actually spells out the case that I mentioned earlier, Chaticha. So we have a piece of meat, Safik Shel Chalev, Safik Shel Shuman, the lowest Chazik Isura. There's no cheskas isur. It's a pure suffix. It was never at any point known to be asur. And here's where we plug in and rely on the testimony of Eidecha Nem Bisur. But now Rashi and Tosfos are going to be at loggerheads to try to determine, how do we know what's the source for Eidecha Nem Bisur? And Rashi says, Hemina Torah kol echad v'echad Yisrael al afroshas truma v'al ashchita v'al nikra gid v'achelev. So the Torah trusts everyone. Now Rashi doesn't quote a pasuk here, but he's working with the premise that we can trust another Jew in these four cases. And in order to really understand this Rashi, we have to add another Rashi that's sort of like the second half of the coin. And that is that Rashi Yevamah says that if we don't trust these people, then a person could never eat from his friend. Not only that, he can't eat in his own household. So it must be that in order to function, we're not going to require two Eidim every time I come home to eat a piece of meat, or every time you invite me and I don't know whether the wine is kosher, or the Trumas Amaisus were removed. So obviously the Torah is going to rely on whoever tells you that he knows that the Truma was taken off, or that the Shechita was done properly. But Tosfos says this is very odd, because Rashi is quoting cases or scenarios in which there's a cheskas isur. And the Gemara says explicitly here at the beginning of Gittin that you only trust Eidecha Nem Bisurin when it's a pure suffix, chelev or shuma, but it's not cheskas isur. Now let's take, for example, shchita. The animal, during its lifetime, is becheskas isur. It's Eivra ben Achai, it's becheskas nevela if it dies. Now we have to come along and testify on the shechita, that the shechita was done properly. You're contradicting the cheskas isur. There was an assumption on that part that it's awesome. Or take, for example, truma. It means that you had tvua that was tevel, and that has a cheskas isur, and the assumption is it remains temel until you know that the chazaka changed, and you need someone to testify that truma was taken off. How then does Rashi quote these cases that seem to be cases which are beyond the nemonis of Eidech and Bisurin? Because the latter is limited to where there's no cheskas isur. Rashi's giving scenarios where there is a cheskas isur. And Tosas says that although he agrees lahalacha that an Eidechad is neman al shchita, we trust the shochet to say that he slaughtered the meat properly, or we trust the balas bayis to say that she was mafresh truma, or we trust the butcher to say that he removed the gid. But that's for a different reason, Tosas says. That's not because of Eidech and Nem Bisur. Eidech and Nem Bisur would never be enough against the Cheskas Isur. But rather we have a principle called Biyado. Biyado means that when something is in the hands of someone, we believe that someone to tell us that he exercised whatever maisa that he had to do, whatever action that he needed to perfect and make sure that the food is kosher. So, for example, a shchita is biyado because he could shech the animal. And afrash's truma is biyado because he can be mafresh truma. And so too for nikra gid. So now Tosas is back to square one. So what is the case in which the Torah tells us that Eidech Nem Bisurin? You're telling me there are cases of biyado. There are cases in which Eidechad would not be believed because it's against the Cheskas Isur. So what is the source for Eidechad Nem Bisurin? V'im Tomar, says Tosfos, you'll see this on the bottom of page 16. Oh, this is really strange. Tosfos is going to point his finger at the nida without touching the nida because the nida has a cheskas isur. And Tosfos wants to give us a case where there is no cheskas isur. And yet the Gemara derives in Masechta Ksubos from the pasuk of Sofra law li'atzma that she can count the zayin nikiyim and make that transition from tumas nida to heter. But v'im tomar im kein afilu bit is chazik isura, we should come to the conclusion based on the parsha of Sofra law in nida that Eidech and Nem Bisurin even against the cheskas isur. So the goal now of Tosfos is on the one hand to maintain that the source for Eidech and Nem Bisurin is nida of Sofra law, and she's going to establish that now she's tahora, and we believe her, even though it's not against the cheskas isur. How could it not be against the cheskas isur? Yesh lomar, the eino b'cheskas sheteroa kol shah. We don't believe that a woman who has what's called dam shofas, that she's shofas forever and ever. And once she counts a period of time that went by, so there's 7 days went by, we already assume that nifsak hamakar, that the makar is no longer producing dam. So ha cheskas isur is gone, because the cheskas isur was a result of the fact that she saw dam, and the dam is shofea. But here we've passed the period of time in which the dam is no longer shofea, and therefore cheskas isur is gone. But that's not true either, because she still needs tefillah b'mikvah. And even after Zayin Nikiyim, or even a year goes by, or 10 years goes by, it doesn't matter. She's always b'cheskas isur until she goes into a mikvah. Who's going to testify that she went into the mikvah? She's going to testify. So a man comes home to his wife, he has to trust her, not just that Zayin Nikiyim went by, but also that she went to the mikvah. And that's certainly a echad against the cheskas isur. Tosfos says, Kisha avru shiva tahora memela, when this period of time passes, HaChazak now changes from a cheskas tuma to a cheskas tara. V'lo es chazik isura. Yeah, but what about the fact that she's still in nida? V'gam biyado litva. So this is an amazing Tosfos because he rejects Rashi, but when he substitutes his own pshat for Rashi, he's open and exposed to the same vulnerability that Rashi was open to. What was the objection to Rashi? That all your cases are cheskas isur, but there's only biyado. So that's not eidech and then bisur. That's biyado against the cheskas isur. And Tosas comes up with an alternative source for eidech and then bisurin, which is a parsha of Nida, and he admits by his own admission that that's also against the cheskas isur until she goes to the mikvah, but it's biyada to go to the mikvah. So established based on Nida, again, the principle of biyado against the cheskas isur is trustworthy. What did Tosfos gain over Rashi? So if you take a look on page 17, he quotes the Marsha. He says, he says, we want to know in a case of, let's say, Safek Chelev, Safek Shumon, which is not against Cheskas Isur, it's neither Biyado, that Eid Echad is Nem Bisurin. That's our classic case. That's the scenario of Eid Echad Nem Bisurin. Where does Tosfos offer a source for it? V'yesh lefarish divrei mishum debenida ikatarte. Tehi tmeya kol zman sheroa v'en biyado lifsok doma. So she doesn't have a biyado as far as psikas adam. V'gam acher kach hi tmeya, and even after she stops seeing dam, which is not biyado, she remains tmeya shetitbo. So we really have like two strikes against her. Number one, that she was a roa, and number two, that she needs a tefillah b'mikvah. Ve'ahok amrinon demishum shehi roa. Tosfos says that the fact that she saw Adam lo mekri yischasik yisura, gave the ena b'chesk she roa kol shah. There's a point in which we assume she's no longer shofaz. Umachbas riyasa, he tahor memelach zayin. In other words, as far as the first din of re'iyah and shofaz dam that generates nidus, that's gone. That's already ancient history. She's now, as far as re'iyah is concerned, tahora. It's after zayin akiyah. Oh, but we have a problem now. I mishum dadayin af. What are you going to say? That we can't trust her even after the Zayin Akiyim, after we've solved the problem of Ischazik Machmas Dam, but she still needs Tefillah b'mikvah. And the answer to that problem is Yesh biyada litbal. So we have now two issues, and we're going to address both of them one by one. One issue is Roa. We're going to address that Cheskas Isur by saying that after a certain period of time, she stops seeing. And Memela, it's no longer Chazik Isur from the perspective of Ro'adam. Now we're going to address the issue of, was she a Toveles, to remove her state of Tara? And the answer is Biyado. V'hashta nicha, the Bein Lav Biyado, V'lo is Chazik Isur, Bein is Chazik Isur, V'biyado, Ikal Melev Shaper Minida. Nida's going to teach me two different principles based on the two isurim or kochos or makoros of tuma. We have one makor of tuma coming from re'iyas dam, and in that context, she's believed to say that she is no longer ro'at dam because that chazak has changed. So here we have a pure suffix. Did she stop seeing dam? Did she not? That's like Safek Chelev, Safek Shumon, and she's believed to say, I'm no longer seeing Dam. Now we're, in addition, going to derive another principle that Eid Echad Nemen Bisurim, when it's Biyado, but the difference is that Biyado gives a power to override a Cheskas Isur. So we have two different halachas that operate in two different modes and two different scenarios. We have one halacha of Eid Echad Nem Bisurin when there's no Cheskas Isur and it's not Biyado. And then we have another issue of Eid Echad Nem Bisurin against the Chazaka, but it is Biyado. So you see where each one is mashal in the other. Each one has a chisaron, and each one has a mila. In the case of dam, whether she sees dam, she has a mila in the fact that naturally she's going to change from a roa to a paska, but we have a drawback. And the drawback is that it doesn't teach me that an Eid Echad could ever be believed against the Cheskas Isa, because as far as dam is concerned, Eid Echad would not be believed against the Cheskas Isa. Now we move over to Tvila B'mikvah. As far as Tvila B'mikvah is concerned, we have a plus and a minus. On the one hand, it's biyado. On the other hand, it's against the Cheskas Isa. So we have Cheskas Isa down in the case of Roa. She's going to be believed because it's only a suffix and there's no Cheskas Isa. She doesn't have biyado. She can't change or alter the bodily function of nidus. But in the case where she has biyado, meaning to change her status from that of a tmeya to that of a tahora, she jumps into the mikveh. Well, on that she has biyado, and on that she's believed even against the Cheskas Isa. Well, basically what we come out with the Maharsha's interpretation Tosfos is what we call tzvei dinim. There are two different dinim that are both subsumed under one general heading called Eid Echad Nem Bisur. And sometimes it's a little bit difficult to discern which of these two dinim, which of these two halachas you're operating with. But basically, what you have to ask yourself are the following questions. Number one, is there a Cheskas Isa or a suffix? Number two, is there an Eid Echad that's reliable? And we'll see about the reliability of Eid Echad. And three, is there a possibility that even if there's no Cheskas Isa, it might be biyado, and we can trust an Eid Echad biyado against the Cheskas Isa? Those are the questions that have to be addressed in the laws of Ne'emanus and Kashrus. Now, here we have the Rashba. I'm a little bit surprised that the Tzurbah MiRabanan put the Rashba here up front, because in my humble opinion, it would seem that the Rashba is just reiterating everything that we know. He says, how do we know that Eid Echad Nem Bisur nafkalam mivasafra lo darshina lo liatzma v'im tomar im kein afilu b'ischazik isura. Even in the case of ischazik isura, v'ein biyado l'sake nami ki hasam. Why? Because she doesn't have control over the dam. Shlomar came on the damya. Hadamel poskim hadamim naturally will cease, will terminate. The mela as a matter of automatic biological fact. The Yemei Sfira Bon Me'alehem, and the 7 days in the Kim also will simply pass in the nature of the universe. Then Chashvin Alei, it's considered like Safek Chelev, Safek Shuma. And the Rashba again is removing the Cheskas Isa as far as the dam is concerned. The Hashda de Kamra Torah ni los Chazik Isura. Mishum Tvila. In Shchita, he's Neman, the Shochet, to testify that this is kosher meat because it's biyada. And even though the animal b'chayeh was b'cheskas isur, and now the Shochet is undermining and clashing with a cheskas isur, he's Neman because of biyada. So we have two different halachas. We have one halacha where it's a suffix and there's no eschazik isura. Eid Echad is believed, and then we have another halacha when there is a chazik bisura, but there's biyado, Eid Echad is believed. Now you get the impression from Rashi that Rashi gemisht als zusammen. It's one big tarovas here. It's according to Rashi, we're not going to go into issues about differentiating between chelev and shuman as opposed to shchita or Hafrashas Truma. It's all the same. Whether it's Eid Echad Nem Bisurin without Biyado, when there's no Cheskas Isur, or Eid Echad Nem Bisurin when it is Biyado, even against the Cheskas Isur, the bottom line is Eid Echad Nem Bisurin. So Rashi supplies us with many different scenarios, some of which could be classified as Biyado, others will be classified as a suffix without a Cheskas Isur, and it's not Biyado. But the bottom line is that in all these scenarios, we can function, says Rashi, Adam ochel mishel chavero. He could eat at somebody else's table or in his own family because of Eid Echad Nem Bisun. Whether it's this kind of Eid Echad Bisun or that kind of Eid Bisun, but it doesn't matter from Rashi's perspective. And it's interesting that Tosfos is operating with the premise that the source of Eid Echad Nem Bisun is dafka biyado against the Cheskas Isur in the case of Nida. But again, as we said, that what Tosfos has in mind is really two different halachas. He's got the Psikas Dam, where there's no Cheskas Isur, and he's got the Tefillah, where there is a Cheskas Isur, but it's beyond it. Now, if that wasn't clear, I'm in trouble. But what I gave you now in the last, I don't know, how many minutes did we start, about 20 minutes ago, is really hours and hours of lumdus, of Torah. But I tried to squeeze it into 20 minutes. I apologize if I went too fast. All right. Now we have a very important Ramah in Yoredei Siman Kuf Chaf Zayin. The Machaber is very nonchalant, non-committal, and very general. Eid Echad Nem Bisurin Lahatir. You don't know whether you can eat this meat. The Torah says that if you're in doubt, you don't know if it's Shuman or Chayil, don't eat it. And if you eat it, you chayav a korban asham, what's called an asham tolui. And the Eid Echad now comes along and says, you know what? I can identify this as Shuman. It's not Chaylev, and then you can eat it. But then the Mechaber adds something else. Avolola hachmir. Now, let's try the following possibility on for size. You know, like you go into a shoe store, you try different shoes and try to hopefully find one pair that fits till you finally leave the store and you say nothing fits. So what I'm going to ask is the following. Let's take the case of a shochet. The shochet testifies that he did a proper shchita, the meat is kosher. Let's call him Reuven. Now Shimon comes in and he says, you know what? I saw the shchita and I know it wasn't a kosher shchita. Says the Mechaber, we believe the shochet and we don't believe Shimon, who came in to say that he knows that it was an improper shchita. And why? This is what you'd call Eid Echad Ba'Chosh. You got one against one. It's basically a stalemate. Why is it that we trust the shochet who says Lahatir midin Eid Echad Misurin, but we don't trust Shimon, the spectator, who says that it was not a kosher shchita? And whatever answer you're going to come up with, it's going to have to justify this statement in the Mechaber, that the Mechaber says that Echad is not believed lahachmir. And here I want to invoke a principle of Ula, which is quoted all over the show. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. Kol mokom shemina bo Torah eid echad harei kan shnayim. If the Torah relies on the testimony of one witness, I'll give you a few examples, then it's considered like two witnesses. And the Torah sort of upgrades one witness to make him into two. It's like if you go on an airplane and you have an upgrade, then they give you an empty seat next to you. Maybe. No, you can't get that lucky. Okay. So what does this mean? How do we upgrade one aid to two aid? Now let's take the example of Misas Habal. A woman is married, her husband goes out to yonder, not the lower part of Canada. I mean, she goes all the way to the north. And one witness comes by and tells her, I have a very bad news for you. Dein Mann ist gestorben. Kaput. Now, hopefully for her, it's bad news. I don't know. But she wants to get remarried at this point, and Eid Echad is believed. The Torah believes the Eid Echad to say Meis Bailech as if he were two witnesses, because in Dover Shebe'erva you need two witnesses. The Torah relied on one aid. Again, whether it's the Torah that relied on 1/8 or the Rabbanan upgraded him to 2/8, that's a whole shir in itself. But the nafkamina is going to be if now 1/8 comes in and said lo meis baila, we're not going to believe the other 8. Or, for example, we have what's called a tumen sota, and after kini and stira, an 8 comes in and says, I know that she had that immoral relationship. She doesn't drink from the Mayamorim. Why not? Because the Torah trusts 1/8. And when the Torah trusts 1/8, he's believed as 2/8. What other example can I think of? Let's say a shliach habal for a get from Medina Sayyam, and we believe him to say b'fanei nechta, b'fanei nechta. If 1/8 is now going to come by and testify that the get was written shalol lishma, he's not believed because we already trusted 1/8. And getting back to our scenario, the shochet testified that this meat is kosher. I did a proper shechita. He's believed like 2/8. And therefore, according to the Mechaber, when another aid comes into Bezdin and contradicts the shochet and says that the meat is not kosher, he's not believed. It's 8 echad b'bokom shnayim. But let's take a look at the Ramah. Umiu yesh omrim to bedover de'ika levrure kigon sha'amar lo echad bovar echa ove kochav menasech yenach. Come over here. I want to show you that in your cellar where the yayin is located, there's a guy who's worshiping with your yayin. Says the Ramah, even though he's testifying lesser, nevertheless we believe him. Why? Because it's a milsa de'ika levrure. We can really check him out. We can find out if there's a guy down there in the cellar who's worshiping his idols. But yet the Ramah writes, tzarech lachush b'dvar. He's not willing to say that the yayin is definitely asur, but we have to consider that as a possibility. The kol davar delo is chazek lo leheter v'lo le'isay echad neman afilu osro. If you have a suffix chelev and a suffix shuman, the Eidech is believed mimanavshach, whether he testifies that this is shuman lahatir or that this is chelev le'asar. He's always believed. And the Rambam goes a step further. The Rambam says that if after the aid testifies that this, I identify this as chelev, you went ahead and ate it in the presence of 2 Eidim and with Asra, you'll get malchus for that. Isra al pi eid echad yuchsa. V'chol heichad is chazik dover be'isra gon tevel o chatichas posa sheina menu keres ein hoed nemen alav latiro elim kein biyodo l'sakno. Strange that the Mechaber left this out. That it could be that it echad nem bisur lahatir depends on whether it's chazik yisura. And if there's no Iskazik Yisur, believe the Eid Echad. If it's Iskazik Yisur, you have to add the hour of Biyado. All this is missing in the Mechaber. The Ramah fills it in. Im kein bekan shtei tichos, acha shal Yisur, acha shal heter, nemana eid lomer zeh heter v'zeh Yisur. Here's a cool case. May we say that the Eid Echad in Suffolk Chalev, Suffolk Shum is believed in both directions. Well, what if he testifies that this one is Chalev and this one is Shuman? He's being matir the Shuman, which was a suffix. He's asering the Chalev, which was a suffix. And he's believed both Lahatir and Les. The Adam Never al Shalo, Afilu Hecha Dischazik Isur. Now, what's going on in this last sentence? Can I challenge anyone here to unmute themselves and tell me what this last statement of the Ramah means? Bruce, Brian, Joe? Absolute silence here. You don't have to be afraid to unmute yourself. I mean, we're all friends here. So Bobby's not here right now, but here's what I wanted to suggest in the Ramah. Adam Neman al Shalo introduces excuse me, another halach entirely. That's called Shavya Nafshech Haticha D'Isura. We have a woman who has a cheskes tahara. She went to the mikvah, kedasu kedin, she's tahora. Now she comes back and she says, a day later, a week later, whatever it is, it's me'ani. I know that I saw dam. That's called Adam Neman al Shalom. So she's going to change the cheskes tahara and be believed to say that she's tmeah. Is not that the case every month with regard to a nida? But now, by believing her that she's tmeah, you've already created a new chazaka to replace the old chazaka, and that's a cheskes isur. Now she's going to testify tahorani. And the Ramah says she's believed because with regard to Shavya Nafshe, whenever you're believed on yourself, you're believed on yourself in both directions. And this is very close to another principle, which, again, we have to figure out where the boundaries of each principle is, called HaPesha also HaPesha Itir. She was the one who established herself as Tmeah. She's the one who's establishing herself as Tahora. And now we turn to the Piskei Tshuva on page 18. Do we have to investigate the aid? Well, two aidim are believed in Dini Momenos, in Dini Fashos, in Dover Sheba. We have to investigate them. We have to interrogate them. Well, we don't just rely on their testimony that this woman is allowed to get married and her husband died. We don't rely on their testimony that Reuven borrowed $1,000 from Shimon, he has to pay it back. We have to be choker v'doresh the Eden. But says the Piskei Tshuva, or as they'd say in Hungary, Piskei Tshiva, we don't have to investigate in Eid Echad. The Eid Echad will say mutter, and we're allowed to eat it. I mean, this has real repercussions in terms of what's called here in Israel a Tudat Hechsher, which I'm sure you have the parallel there in Toronto. A Tudat Hechsher means what? Means it's kosher. But wait a minute, I want to investigate this. There are many different issues. I want to know if they were all covered. Is there a mashgiach tmidi? What's going on over here? And Eid Echad Nebi Surid, says the Piskei Tshuva, is so powerful that it completely circumvents the need for Drisha v'Chakir. Just give me the bottom line. It's like there's a famous story about Reb Chaim Brisker, that there was an issue of a get in Brisk. So he sent a telegram to Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan, Spector, the Gadol Adon. He says, send me back an answer to this question, whether the get is kosher or not. But do me a favor, he said. Don't give me any explanations. Because if you give me any explanations, I'm going to slug them up, and then I'm in trouble. Just tell me if the get is reliable. That's Eid Echad Nebi. And now we have to ask the most contemporary question. Can you trust someone in Kashrus who might be reliable in Kashrus, perhaps, meaning, it's someone who would never eat non-kosher food, but they're Machal Shabbos? Like, you remember the bakeries in the old days, they used to say Shomer Shabbos. Now everybody knows that this is a Fruma Yid, and he's baking and selling in a bakery. We don't even need that sign. It's upgrade. It's assumed that he's Shomer Shabbos. The Rama writes the following: Hamisareach Eitzel Abalabais. He's a guest in someone's home. There are many foodstuffs, food items, and he's bringing them out. If the Baal Bais brings it out, then he means to tell you that it's kosher. Very similar to what we saw in the Piskei Tshuva. No need to investigate it. The Afal Pisheno Makiro El Yodeh Shehu Yehudi Bilvad. He knows he's Jewish. However, in Huchzak She'eno Kosher, he's not a kosher Jew. V'lo medagdik b'dvarim elu. he's not medagdik in all the different issues about chatichas dag, about yayin, about gvina, about basar. Asul is arich etzlo. Don't even bother to show up in his house and be a guest. Now, in a minute, the Rambam is going to ask a different question, which we'll get to. But first, I want to tell you a story. My father, Zichron Livracha, was a Rav of a shul in Flatbush in Brooklyn for close to half a century. You may know the Nussbaums who davened in my father's shul. And my father would very often get invited, my mother and my father, as guests to a balabas's house. And this is a typical issue that a Rav faces in the modern contemporary world. I'm not talking about a Rav in Kiryat Sanz or a Rav in Mea Sha'arim. I'm talking a Rav in Flatbush of those days where you could count the Shomer Shabbos people on one hand. People don't realize that about Flatbush. So, for example, in England, you've got different kinds of synagogues that belong to different movements. You know, you've got synagogues where most of the people are not Shomer Shabbos. Baruch Hashem, they come to shul, and we can only thank God for such a phenomenon. But they're not Shomer Shabbos. And there's a whole issue whether we should encourage them to come to shul if we know that they're going to drive on Shabbos. Whole issues about this. But these are the contemporary issues. Now they invite you to their house. The president of the shul invites you for a kiddush in his house. And again, I'm whispering here, but he's not a Shomer Shabbos. Says the Rambam, Asul Isarich Etzlo. Now, we would like to find some flexibility here. Now, what happens when that person who's inviting you shows you that he ordered all the food, let's say it's disposable dishes, it's all double wrapped, and it has a kosher symbol from one of the most reliable rabbinic boards, COR, whatever your favorite one, OU, whatever it is. So that's a different story. That food is sealed and double sealed with a stempel on it that says our rabbinical board will testify to the kashrus of the food. But if he's serving you open food and taking food out of from the oven, from the stove, from the kitchen, from the fridge, whatever it is, then the Rambam says that's not where you want to be. But again, there are nuances of differences in every scenario. Every case is different. It's very difficult to get a clear-cut principle that will always answer every issue that comes up. So many factors. There's kiruv, and then there's, trying to create a friendship and not insulting someone. There's so many issues here. And unfortunately, this is so prominent or common in the contemporary society. But getting back to the Rambam, maybe he shouldn't have taken up the balabas on his invitation, but he did so. Now he's there at the table of the balabas. What happens? Eino ochel basar, v'eino shosei yayin. We have to know that this basar is kosher. Give me one aid that's reliable, that is Shomer Shabbos and Shomer Mitzvahs, to testify that he knows this basar is kosher. Yayin. 99% of yayin is not kosher. I remember I used to go into that, what was it called? You had to, those stores that are licensed to sell alcohol in Canada.
LCBO.
Say it again?
LCBO.
LCBO. Boy, it sounds like one of those movements that don't differentiate between the genders. I don't know. But anyway, so you go in there, and then they look at you and they say, hey, you're not even 18 years old. Get out of here. Okay, I didn't have that experience. But after a while, you look for the wines, and because it's in a Jewish neighborhood, they're smart enough to keep themselves well stacked with kosher wines. But then you go to a neighborhood that's Asian primarily, and you look amongst the wines, you really have to stand on your head and somersault in order to find a kosher wine. So Baruch Hashem, we have wines that are sealed, and there's a hechsher on the wine, we can avoid that problem. But here, in the Rambam's favorite reference, he's serving you a cup of wine, and he's not a kosher Jew. And the Rambam says, don't drink the wine. But it's interesting that the Rambam began with gvina and chatichas dag. Now, gvina, I have a problem with, but a chatichas dag I can explain, because if the fish is whole and it has on it scales, then it's a kosher fish. Even though you need two simoni kashrus, you need kaskeses and snapir, which are the fins, but the Gemara tells us that any fish that has the proper kaskeses, which means the scales, it has fins, even if they cut off the fins. But what about gvina? I don't know. How would you know it's kosher cheese?
No idea. Well, that's what it's saying. Chatichas dag, because you're not going to be able to see whether or not it has scales or fins. That's why it's saying chaticha.
Well, if that's what the Rambam means, why does he say aval eno ochel basa v'lo shosa yayin? In the beginning of the Rambam, he spoke about gvina and chatichas dag. At the end of the Rambam, he leaves it out. I don't know. It's a little bit strange.
You don't think that he's...
That he's referring to all those cases, maybe. Because he says, he's already sitting at the guy's table, and the Rambam only mentions basar and yayin. I don't know why the Rambam dropped the ball on dag and gvina.
Maybe he means to add them as well. He's just saying those two, those were the liquid,
maybe
liquid and solid.
It's just a little bit strange that, he starts with 4 examples and then he concludes with only 2 out of the 4. Okay. Now, what happens, asks the Machaber in Shulchan Aruch, if a person is very careful about the biblical Doraisa laws of Kashrus, but he doesn't care about their abundance. So, for example, dam beitzim bisman hazeh, we don't have fertilized eggs. I mean, you can get fertilized eggs if you go out to a farm, but our eggs are not fertilized eggs. So the dam is only d'Rabbanan. And he doesn't care about the d'Rabbanans. You talk to me about Doraisas, I can follow suit, but not on d'Rabbanans. So Shulchan Aruch writes he's not believed in Kashrus. Ramos says that even if the mocher, af eitzel misheno mocher b'cheskes kashrus, v'lo rak eitzel chosh. I think instead of mocher, I think we should read it mukar. Okay, so the Ramah is pointing out that if you don't know this guy, he's guilty until proven innocent. You don't assume that he's kosher unless you know that he's kosher. So the Shulchan Aruch paskins hachoshed lechol dvar masurim beinu uchoshed b'isur Torah beinu uchoshed b'isur Rabbanon ein lismach ola bahem v'yim nisareach imo lo yochal mishalo b'dvarim shu choshed aleim v'yesh omrim afilu mi she'eno choshud rak she'ein makirin oso. He's guilty until proven innocent. Also, liknos many yayin o sharon dvarim sheish lochush leisur miu im nisarech etzo ochel imo. So again, to buy food that's pre-prepared and might not be kosher, from someone that you don't know whether he's kosher or not, you don't recognize the guy, that you can't do. That's where you need the Tudas section. But if, on the other hand, somebody invites you for a meal, then the Ramah is a little bit more mekil. And if you don't know for sure that he's non-kosher, if you know what I mean, then you can assume he's kosher. And that's what he writes him. If we know that he's suspect on kashrus, ein lechol etzlo, but dafka b'dvarim sheyesh lochush mehem les. Let's say he gives you fruits or vegetables that you can eat. And what's the chiddush here? You might say, well, you know what? This looks a little funny. You're going to eat a meal in someone's house and he's choshed on kashrus. Oh, I only ate the the vegetables and the fruits. He gave me an apple to eat, he gave me an orange, but I didn't eat meat or wine or anything like that. Doesn't smell right. But the Ramah allows you to do. And the Taz says that in Darkei Moshe, lechol afilu dvar mutar. Don't be invited to his house at all. Don't even drink a glass of water. Stay away. Just make an absolute cut, so to speak. Now, we have two categories of Rishayim. Rishayim means those who violate the Torah. We have something called a mumar l'teyavon, and we have somebody called a mumar lahachis. Basically, a mumar l'teyavon is someone who eats non-kosher food, heaven forbid, because of monetary gain. Kosher meat is too expensive for him, in inverted commas. That's called over avera l'teyavon. If you gave him two pieces of meat and said, choose one of them, this one's kosher, this one's not, he would choose the kosher meat. You have another Rasha who's much worse than that. He's a mumar lahachis. He'll dafka take the non-kosher meat. And I know that in Toronto you won't find anyone like that, but here in Israel, unfortunately, they're in the Knesset even. Okay, fine. I didn't say that. Now, the Ramah says something that's very difficult to understand. Ovrei aver l'teyavon lo mikri choshed. We just finished saying that someone who's choshed, you can't eat from his table. Now we're saying that an over aver l'teyavon is not a choshed. So the Taz immediately on the bottom of 18, going on to page 19, objects. He says, "Kvodo b'mkomo munach." With all due respect to the Ramah, dvar tmuim. By Yosef Kosheli delo matzinu sheyeh choshed gara tfei over l'teyavon. Who's going to be more suspicious and suspect that you on kashrus than a mumar l'teyavon? The isal kedai to the choshed who sheinu choshesh liser klal harei be'emes hu ka'ove kochavim gomu. No, he doesn't care about the isur. He cares about his pocketbook. He's like acting like a guy. As far as kashrus, he's treifin yak. And then at the end of this Taz, he quotes the Darkei Moshe in the name of Hagos Ashri, Mishu Choshed al Isur Sha'asur Lechol Ima Afilu Dvarim Mutarim Shema Yachilenu Dvarim Asurim Gamkin. You shouldn't even be eating in his house, even vegetables and fruits. You never know what he's going to slip in. And before you know it, you're eating who knows what. Okay. Now, one of the contemporary poskim in the Shevet Halevi says that if you shouldn't have eaten in his house and taken him off an invitation, but if you find yourself at his table, you can eat that which you know is kosher. You don't have to stomp out there and say, I'm not eating anything. I don't want a cup of water. But the problem is, what do we do with this Ramah? Over aver l'tiyavon lo mikri chashut. So I believe that the Ramah has the following in mind. If in that location, in that area, kosher food is accessible, very often you find yourself somewhere where, there's one kosher restaurant in a radius of who knows how many miles, and the prices are sky high. And by the way, it's not only that they're trying to rip you off, it could be that their expenses to get kosher meat out there in, I don't know where, are very high expenses. They're just passing on to you their expenses. Places that import, shechted meat from who knows where. But let's assume that right here, the prices of non-kosher and kosher food, meat, are identical. You go to the supermarket and there it is. Here's the kosher section and here's the non-kosher section. I remember in the north, what was the name of that gigantic supermarket? Like when you get to, Vaughan, you know what I mean? And there's Sobeys. There's tremendous, you can get so much gashmis there that's kosher. Every pie and every piece of cake that challahs, whatever you wanted in the kosher section. So assuming, again, this is not reality, but in fantasy world, the prices are the same. You've got, treifa meat on one side, and you've got kosher meat right next to it. So in such a case, even though this man is not makbid on his own kashrus, but if he tells you that he bought the food from the kosher meat, he's not a lahachiznik. He's only trying to save himself a buck. Maybe that's what the Ramah has in mind. I don't know. Okay, then. Now, what we're up to now is the tshuva of Rav Moshe Feinstein, which is a breakthrough tshuva. And he wants to come up with a kula that nobody would have even imagined. And we're talking about an unfortunate circumstance, which is so contemporary, where a father is makbid on the halacha, kechut hasayra, on kashrus, and he has children who are not kosher. Maybe he's a bal tshuva. And his daughter-in-law puts out food for him, and he knows it's kosher. How does he know it's kosher? So Rav Moshe Feinstein claims he knows it's kosher because of an ongoing relationship that he has, the father with his children. And from past experience, what's the word I'm looking for? When you want to evaluate someone's past performance, and they have a certain like in baseball, the guy
track record.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Bobby. I owe you a lot. I haven't heard that phrase track record probably in about 13 years. Okay, a track record. His children have a very good track record. In the past, they've always been very careful to buy the food from a kosher source, and the food was packaged, and it had a COR label on it, whatever it is. But this time, it doesn't have any labels. So on the one hand, you're talking about someone who's kosher on kashrus. They're not kosher. But on the other hand, they have a great, reliable track record. Says Rav Moshe Feinstein, ha'av yodea, v'kimle v'gava, debito v'kalosa, whether it's his daughter or his daughter-in-law, shalo yachshilu be'isur. They're very honest people, especially with regard to their own father. They respect their father's interests and his will. Umakir betiva, the idea brura is absolute conviction. There's a track record here. He's tested her on many different occasions, and she always brought kosher food. Yachol lismoch aleha v'lechol masha bishla ba'ad. Now, don't think we're talking about milchiks here. You know, we're more mekel and milchiks. We're talking about basar, says Rav Moshe. V'chol dover k'sha'amr lo shu bi basar kosher, ubi kelim shezmina avuro, she ordered special kelim for him that he could be somech on. And I go back to the scenario that I described earlier. The president of the shul invites the rabbi for a meal. The president of the shul, you know, if you ask him if he's kosher or not, he tells you, I'm kosher on the inside, but not on the outside. You know what that means? You know, eating the treifa, you know, we have in New York, we have wolfies. I don't know if you ever heard of it. Anyway, it's a real treif, you know, seafood and all the like, and all the chazarai. And, you know, if he invites you for Thanksgiving dinner, everything's kosher. But when they go out to wolfies, you know that they're not reliable. And yet Rav Moshe says, at least in the case of a father and a daughter, and I would assume we could extrapolate. You see, why is it that when you read Psak Halacha in general, you always find chumras? Very rarely do you find kulas. This happens to be an exception to the rule. And Rav Moshe has a Tzurbah Bechol Vakum, also full of kulas. Poskim are very hesitant to publicize their views lekula because they know it's going to lead to, everyone's going to make an equation. You know, Rav Moshe is talking about a case of a daughter, and the father's checked her out time after time again. She has a great track record, and she knows that. And he knows that his daughter would never fool him and trip him up with non-kosher food. I don't know if the same thing applies even to the president of the shul. Not to say that he's going to deliberately feed the rabbi non-kosher food, but inadvertently he's not careful. You know, you don't know if the kalim, you don't know if he went to the right store to buy the right food. You don't know. It's not double sealed or anything like that. And you read Rav Moshe's Tzurbah and you say, my high, you know, yesh lashvot, let's see, let's extrapolate it and compare one case to the other. And that's why the poskim are very, very inhibited. They think a lot before they publish a Tzurbah.
But Rav, isn't there an issue, you know, like that it could be that they're ignorant of issues that they have to be, that they're not. You have to know that they know what they're talking about. Correct.
So that's what Rav Moshe says, that he has tested her time after time after time. She knows exactly where to buy the meat, who to trust, which kashrus, and she understands her father's standards. And she always lives up to her father's demands and standards. Again, it's a big kula here. This is a landmark tshuva in the sense it's very revolutionary.
As we're not talking about her cooking.
They're not cooking. He says the following, that Yachol lismoch aleha lechol masha mevasheles.
Wow.
You don't have it in front of you. It should be in your phone, I think.
Yeah. I have it.
Lechol masha mevasheles ba'ado mibasar. No, she's not cooking cheese for you. She's cooking meat for you. Now, again, there's no issue of Bishal Akko because she's Jewish. But who knows what's, what ingredients she uses, spices or, they have these various kinds of what do they call those things? Duck sauce. I'm talking about all these different kinds of sauces. There are kosher products. And he's saying that she's been tried and true and tested. She has a great track record. She would never try to trip up her father. And that's he's convinced. Again, he's got to have a idea brewer. You saw the language of emotion. Like in the tshuva on Cholavakum, Rav Moshe also requires Yediyah Brura, but he just doesn't require that there be a mashgiach who saw the actual chaliva, but there are other ways that we can know it's a Yediyah Brura. And today, in general, in the world of kashrus, we have so many kinds of lab tests. There's so many ways of determining kashrus that even if the lab is run by a guy, we can rely on it. Okay, he says that, you have to fulfill all these conditions in order to be absolutely convinced that the food is kosher. And that leads us to the Stei Chemet on page 20. And this is going to get us into the issue of those who want to be machmer on themselves and not trust, the standard kashrus institutions and labels and rabbinic bodies. Is there room to be machmer al atzmo, and maybe we should encourage him to be machmer al atzmo? That's the subject of the Stei Chemet, who was a Rav in Yerushalayim HaKodesh over 100 years ago. And he was a Sephardic Rav. At that time, Yerushalayim was run by the Sephardim. I found it fascinating. I once read, it's many, many volumes. I once read a tshuva of the Stei Chemet. I'll conclude with this, about reciting the Yud Gimel Midos HaRachamim after Shachris and reciting Vidui on a daily basis, Kinusach Sfarad. And I don't know, in Clanton Park it's Nusach Sfarad, I forget.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So do you do like they do in Israel, that every day they recite Vidui?
Yes.
You do have it.
Yes.
Guess what? The Stei Chemet, who was a Sephardic Rav, was opposed to that minhag. Now, I'm not going to, I don't want to tell you to change your minhag, but it's very interesting, his logic. He says that, if you perfunctorily daily recite Vidui, it becomes just words. And Vidui is a serious thing. You got to take Vidui seriously, with a lot of machshava. So, B'li Neder, we'll try to continue with this. My wife and I are thinking about going away for a week. I don't know. I don't think it's going to happen because. But if you know anything about travel, it's like if maybe Larry could help me. Maybe I can do something. It all depends on where Chabad is. When you travel, you got to rely on Chabad.
Chabad is everywhere.
Right, but you have to make sure
locations
that if you want to spend Shabbos somewhere where there's Chabad, you got to make sure that you're in walking distance to Chabad. And if you don't speak Portuguese and you go online and they tell you, where the hotel is in Portuguese. I mean, when I was in high school, I studied a little Spanish, un poco español. Of course, I forgot all that Spanish, which means the whole system is rotten. But anyway, that's a different discussion. But I certainly didn't learn a word of Portuguese, So you want to go to a place like Lisbon, Portugal. I have a member of my shul that raves about it. It was such a beautiful country, and he saw Jewish sites and this and that. But I don't know. He when I asked him where did he stay in relation to Chabad? So again, he wasn't there on Shabbos, so maybe it's less of a problem. All right. Anyway, wishing you all a great a great week, and
All too.
Baruch Lov.
well, if
Thank
there's
you
any
very
changes
much.
for next week, I'll let you know. All right then.
Okay, thank you.